Welcome, friends. Before we set sail into the vast and fascinating story of the Age of Exploration, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more relaxing journeys through history. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there, so leave a comment below. Your responses make this a true voyage around the world. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift into the great story of the Age of Exploration. In the centuries leading up to what we call the Age of Exploration, the world was both vast and, in many ways, disconnected. Civilizations had risen and fallen, empires had expanded and contracted, and trade routes had stitched together fragments of the old world. But compared to the maps we know today, the medieval vision of the globe was incomplete, a blend of known coastlines, rumored lands, and mythical realms. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the primary link between Europe and the wealth of Asia lay in the overland trade routes collectively known as the Silk Road. These were not single roads, but an intricate network of caravan paths stretching from China through Central Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Along them flowed silk, spices, gems, porcelain, precious metals, and knowledge. It was a meeting place for cultures, religions, and ideas. One of the most important conduits of this trade was the Islamic world. From the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, Muslim merchants, scholars, and sailors connected markets and knowledge systems. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople thrived as hubs of commerce. The wealth of India, the spices of the Moluccas, and the silks of China could all, in time, make their way to European markets at a price. But by the late Middle Ages, these routes faced growing instability. The Mongol Empire, whose dominance in the 13th century had created an unprecedented period of safety for overland trade, fragmented. In the 14th century, the Black Death ravaged populations from China to Europe, disrupting commerce and shrinking economies. In the 15th century, the rise of the Ottoman Empire brought new political realities. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the Byzantine Empire ended, and with it, Christian Europe's easy access to many Eastern markets. At the same time, European society was experiencing profound changes. The Renaissance was sparking a revival of learning, scientific curiosity, and human ambition. Advances in navigation and shipbuilding began to hint at new possibilities. While the Mediterranean powers, Venice, Genoa, and others, still commanded sea trade with the East through intermediaries, the rising kingdoms of Portugal and Spain looked to bypass the old routes altogether. The spirit of the age. The desire to explore was not born solely of curiosity. It was tied to economics, religion, and politics. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were not mere luxuries. They were crucial for preserving and flavoring food. Gold and silver were always in demand. Fine silks, precious stones, and exotic goods carried enormous prestige. But beyond material wealth lay religious motivation. The late medieval Christian world was deeply concerned with the spread of its faith. The Reconquista in Spain, the centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule, had instilled a crusading spirit in the Spanish and Portuguese alike. Some dreamed of finding the legendary Christian king Prester John, believed to rule in some far-off land, to form an alliance against Islam. Others hoped to reach the fabled lands of the East, described by travelers like Marco Polo, and to convert their rulers. There was also the lure of fame. In a Europe where the printing press was making news and stories spread faster than ever before, the exploits of adventurers could become known across the continent. The names of kings and captains could be immortalized. Technological foundations. For centuries, much of Europe's seafaring was coastal. Ships were designed for short voyages and for hugging the shoreline. But by the 15th century, innovations made longer journeys possible. The caravel, developed by the Portuguese, was a nimble ship with lateen sails that allowed it to sail closer to the wind. This meant it could tack and maneuver more easily than older designs, making it ideal for exploration. The magnetic compass and the astrolabe, both of which had roots in earlier Chinese and Islamic science, allowed sailors to determine their direction and latitude at sea with greater accuracy. Portolan charts, detailed nautical maps based on careful observation of coastlines, gave navigators a far better picture of known waters. These tools did not eliminate the dangers of long voyages, but they made such journeys conceivable. With them, sailors could dare to venture into the open ocean, beyond the sight of land. Portugal's pioneering role. The Kingdom of Portugal, small in size but ambitious in outlook, became the first European power to systematically pursue oceanic exploration. Its location on the Atlantic coast gave it direct access to open seas. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal began to sponsor voyages down the west coast of Africa. Though Henry himself was not a sailor, he supported shipbuilding, navigation studies, and expeditions that pushed further and further south. The goals were multiple: to find a maritime route to the riches of Asia, to establish profitable trade in gold and other African goods, to spread Christianity, and to outflank Islamic powers controlling overland routes. In the 1430s and 1440s, Portuguese ships reached the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands, claiming them for the crown. These islands became important waypoints for later transatlantic voyages. By mid-century, Portuguese explorers had rounded Cape Bojador, a feat once thought impossible due to treacherous currents and fears of sea monsters. Each success encouraged bolder ventures. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had reached the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. This was a crucial step toward reaching Asia by sea. Spain's rising ambition. While Portugal pushed south and east, its Iberian neighbor, Castile, soon to unite with Aragon to form Spain, watched with interest. For much of the 15th century, Spanish energies were focused on the final stages of the Reconquista. But when Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, fell in 1492, Spain's Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, turned their gaze outward. That same year, they backed an ambitious proposal from an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus. Convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic, Columbus promised to open a new route to the wealth of the Indies. His voyage, as we shall see, would not find the spice markets of the East, but it would alter the course of world history forever. The year 1492 marked a turning point not only for Spain, but for the entire world. When Christopher Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera on August 3rd, his journey was the culmination of centuries of speculation, ambition, and experimentation. While others had dreamed of reaching Asia by sailing west, Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to make that dream a royal enterprise. Columbus's bold proposal. Columbus was from Genoa, a maritime republic whose sailors had long plied the Mediterranean and beyond. By the time he approached Ferdinand and Isabella, he was already an experienced navigator. He had sailed to Ireland, possibly Iceland, and along the west coast of Africa. He had also studied maps and writings that suggested the Earth was smaller than widely believed, and that Asia could be reached quickly by crossing the Atlantic. Most scholars of the late 15th century knew the Earth was round. The notion of a flat Earth was largely a myth, but they disagreed on its size. Columbus believed Asia lay much closer to Europe across the Atlantic than it actually did. If he had known the true distance, he might never have attempted the voyage. The Portuguese had rejected his proposal, focusing instead on the proven route around Africa. But Spain, eager to rival Portugal and newly freed from the demands of the Reconquista, was willing to gamble. In April 1492, the monarch signed the capitulations of Santa Fe, granting Columbus titles, privileges, and a share of any profits from his discoveries. The first voyage. Columbus's fleet consisted of 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. These were not massive galleons, but small vessels by later standards. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was a larger carrack, while the Niña and Pinta were caravels. Lighter, faster ships better suited to exploration. The fleet stopped at the Canary Islands for repairs and supplies before venturing westward into the open Atlantic. For weeks, no land appeared. The crew grew restless and fearful, muttering about turning back. Columbus urged them on, using every bit of his authority and charisma to maintain morale. On October 12, 1492, land was sighted. The fleet had reached one of the Bahamian islands, which Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, he referred to the local inhabitants as Indios. Over the following weeks, he explored parts of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, marveling at the tropical landscapes, the unfamiliar flora and fauna, and the cultures of the indigenous peoples. Yet Columbus's first contact with the New World also foreshadowed a darker chapter. He took some of the inhabitants captive, both as translators and as proof of his voyage's success, and he wrote of their potential for conversion to Christianity and their suitability for servitude. When the Santa Maria ran aground on Hispaniola, Columbus used its timbers to build a small settlement, La Navidad, leaving behind a garrison before sailing back to Spain in early 1493. His return was triumphant. He paraded exotic goods, parrots, and several indigenous captives before the court. The monarch celebrated him as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and plans for further voyages began almost immediately. The Treaty of Tordesillas. Columbus's discoveries alarmed Portugal. The Portuguese crown feared that Spain's westward expansion would infringe on territories they claimed under earlier papal decrees. To prevent conflict, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of bulls granting Spain rights to lands west of a demarcation line in the Atlantic. But Portugal objected to the line's position, and negotiations followed. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. This agreement shifted the line farther west, giving Portugal a claim to lands that would later become Brazil, as well as free rein along its established African and Asian routes. Spain received the rest of the Americas, at least in theory. In practice, the treaty ignored the presence of existing indigenous civilizations and was unknown to many other European powers who would later challenge Iberian claims. The treaty had profound consequences. By a twist of geography, the line ran through the eastern tip of South America, which is why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil today. It also set the stage for centuries of Spanish-Portuguese rivalry, a rivalry that would shape global politics far beyond the Americas. Columbus's later voyages. Columbus made 3 more voyages to the Americas between 1493 and 1504. On his second expedition, he returned with a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,000 men, determined to establish a permanent colony. The settlement at La Navidad had been destroyed, its garrison killed, likely in retaliation for mistreatment of the local population. Columbus founded a new town, Isabella, on Hispaniola, but it struggled with disease, poor supplies, and tensions with both indigenous peoples and Spanish settlers. On subsequent voyages, Columbus explored parts of the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the coasts of Central and South America. But he never reached the Asian markets he had sought, and his fortunes declined. Accusations of mismanagement and cruelty toward both colonists and indigenous peoples led to his arrest and removal from his governorship. Though eventually freed, Columbus died in 1506, still convinced he had reached the fringes of Asia. The conquistadors and the expansion of Spain's empire. While Columbus's voyages opened the door, it was the generation of explorers and conquerors who followed that transformed Spain into a global empire. The Spanish crown granted licenses, or capitulaciones, to adventurers willing to explore, conquer, and govern new territories in exchange for a share of the profits. One of the earliest and most significant conquests was that of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés between 1519 and 1521. Landing on the coast of modern-day Mexico, Cortés forged alliances with indigenous groups hostile to Aztec rule, most notably the Tlaxcalans. His forces, though, vastly outnumbered, benefited from superior weapons, horses, and the devastating impact of Old World diseases like smallpox, which decimated the Aztec population. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the beginning of Spanish dominance in Mesoamerica. In South America, Francisco Pizarro led the conquest of the Inca Empire between 1532 and 1533. Arriving during a civil war between rival claimants to the Inca throne, Pizarro captured the emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca and used him as leverage to control the empire. Despite receiving a massive ransom of gold and silver, the Spaniards executed Atahualpa, seizing the vast wealth and territory of the Incas. The flow of wealth and the Columbian exchange. The conquests brought unimaginable wealth to Spain. Galleons loaded with silver from Potosí in present-day Bolivia and gold from the Caribbean crossed the Atlantic, fueling Spain's economy and funding its European wars. But the consequences of these encounters were far more complex than simple plunder. The Columbian exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the old and new worlds, reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Europe gained crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao, which would become staples. The Americas received wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and sheep, along with devastating diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, which wiped out large portions of indigenous populations. The Spanish established a colonial system based on encomiendas, grants of land and indigenous labor to Spanish settlers, which often led to brutal exploitation. Missionaries, meanwhile, sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, sometimes learning local languages and defending communities, but often erasing traditional beliefs and practices. By the early 16th century, Spain had become the dominant European power in the Americas. Yet its monopoly would not go unchallenged. Portugal, England, France, and later the Netherlands would all seek their share of the riches and influence that overseas exploration promised. While Spain's gaze was fixed westward, Portugal continued to press its advantage along the coast of Africa and toward the riches of Asia. This was not an overnight project. Decades of incremental exploration, trade posts, and navigational experimentation laid the foundation for one of the most profitable and far-reaching empires of the early modern world. The vision of Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry of Portugal, though never a great sailor himself, deserves recognition as the early architect of Portuguese exploration. He established a school for navigation at Sagres, bringing together mapmakers, shipwrights, and experienced mariners. From the 1420s onward, Portuguese expeditions crept southward along Africa's Atlantic coast. The initial aims were modest: fishing grounds, gold, and trade in goods like ivory. But there was also the hope of reaching the Christian kingdom of Prester John, believed to lie somewhere inland, a fantasy that persisted well into the 16th century. Each new voyage extended Portuguese maps, knowledge of currents, and familiarity with coastal peoples. By the time of Henry's death in 1460, Portugal had reached the Gulf of Guinea and begun trading for gold dust and enslaved Africans, a grim foreshadowing of the transatlantic slave trade that would expand in later centuries. Rounding the Cape, Bartolomeu Dias. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias achieved what had once seemed impossible. He rounded the southern tip of Africa. He called it the Cape of Storms, a name that reflected the violent weather he faced, but King John II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope to emphasize the promise it held: a direct sea route to India and the spice trade. Dias's voyage proved that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, but he turned back before reaching India, his crew exhausted and supplies running low. Nevertheless, his journey set the stage for one of the most celebrated expeditions in maritime history: Vasco da Gama's epic voyage. In 1497, King Manuel Verve appointed Vasco da Gama to command a fleet with the express mission of reaching India by sea. His expedition would change the balance of global trade. The fleet consisted of 4 ships, leaving Lisbon in July 1497. Following the African coast, they stopped at trading posts and friendly ports before crossing into the Indian Ocean, a bold move made possible by knowledge of monsoon winds learned from Arab and Swahili sailors. In May 1498, Da Gama arrived at Calicut, modern-day Kozhikode, on India's Malabar coast, a major hub in the spice trade. Here, he encountered a complex network of Muslim, Hindu, and other traders, all of whom had long-standing commercial ties reaching as far as the Middle East and China. While Da Gama's initial reception was cordial, the Portuguese were unprepared for the sophistication of Indian markets. Their gifts, simple European goods like cloth and trinkets, were underwhelming to local rulers used to fine silks and jewels. Nevertheless, Da Gama secured a trade agreement, loading his ships with spices for the return voyage. The journey back to Lisbon was grueling, with scurvy and storms claiming many lives. Yet, when the survivors returned in 1499, their cargo's value far outweighed the losses. Portugal had found a sea route to the fabled spice markets and would defend it fiercely. The Estado da India, Portugal's maritime empire. Within a few years, Portugal began building a chain of fortified outposts, the Estado da India, to control the flow of goods between Asia, Africa, and Europe. Under commanders like Francisco de Almeida and Afonso de Albuquerque, Portuguese fleets seized key choke points: Kilwa, Mombasa and Sofala along Africa's east coast, Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, Goa, on India's west coast, which became the capital of the Estado de India Malacca, controlling the vital strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. By controlling these strategic ports, Portugal could dominate maritime trade routes without needing to conquer vast inland territories. Albuquerque in particular understood that holding these keys would force traders from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf to pass through Portuguese-controlled waters. He also pursued alliances, often marrying Portuguese officers to local noblewomen to cement ties, though these relationships could just as easily sour into conflict. Trade, faith, and conflict. The Portuguese sought more than just spices. They traded in gold, textiles, and precious stones, and they were deeply involved in the trade of enslaved people. At the same time, missionaries, especially Jesuits, accompanied expeditions to spread Catholicism. Goa became a center of missionary activity, with schools, churches, and printing presses. But this expansion was not without fierce opposition. Muslim traders from the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and the Swahili coast resisted Portuguese intrusion. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese faced naval coalitions determined to break their monopoly. The Siege of Diu in 1509 marked one of the first major naval battles between European and Asian Muslim fleets in these waters, and a decisive Portuguese victory. Reaching further east, China and Japan. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese traders had reached the coasts of China and Japan. In 1557, they secured permission to settle in Macau, which would remain under Portuguese control until 1999. In Japan, Portuguese merchants introduced firearms, which would have a lasting impact on the country's warfare, along with Christianity and new trade goods. Though their numbers were small, Portuguese traders had an outsized influence by serving as intermediaries between different Asian markets and Europe. They connected the silk of China, the silver of Japan, the spices of the Moluccas, and the markets of Lisbon. Portugal's global reach. By 1550, the Portuguese Empire spanned 4 continents. In addition to its Asian holdings, Portugal controlled Brazil, claimed after Cabral's 1500 voyage, accidentally landed on its shores. Sugar plantations there would soon become a cornerstone of the colonial economy, fueled by enslaved African labor. Portugal's global network was a marvel of the time, but it was also fragile. It depended on narrow sea routes, vulnerable to storms, piracy, and rival powers. And rivals were coming. Spain's growing American empire, England's nascent seafaring ambitions, France's interest in overseas ventures, and later Dutch maritime power would all chip away at Portuguese dominance. Life aboard Portuguese voyages. For the sailors who manned Portugal's fleets, life at sea was as grueling as it was dangerous. Voyages could last months or even years, and the cramped conditions aboard caravels and carracks left little room for comfort. Food consisted mainly of salted meat, hardtack, dried legumes, and sometimes rancid cheese. Fresh water quickly became stale in casks, and the lack of fresh produce meant that scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat. Sleeping arrangements were minimal, hammocks or makeshift bedding on the hard deck. Privacy was non-existent, and disease spread easily in such close quarters. Yet the allure of adventure, the possibility of plunder, and the potential for royal rewards drew thousands into service. Sailors faced not only storms and shipwrecks, but also hostile encounters along the African and Asian coasts. Pirates, rival European fleets, and local naval forces all posed threats. Navigation, despite advances, still relied heavily on dead reckoning, coastal landmarks, and the skill of the pilot. A single navigational error could doom a voyage. The Portuguese in East Africa. Before securing their hold on India, the Portuguese established a chain of fortified bases along Africa's east coast. These included Sofala, a gold trading port in modern Mozambique, and Kilwa, once one of the most prosperous Swahili city-states. The arrival of the Portuguese disrupted centuries-old trade networks linking Africa, Arabia, and Asia. They imposed cartazes, naval passes required for ships to trade legally in the Indian Ocean, under threat of seizure or destruction. This system effectively turned the Portuguese into maritime tax collectors, a role that bred resentment among local merchants. Despite tensions, Portuguese outposts became melting pots of culture, language, and commerce. Mixed communities of Portuguese settlers, African merchants, and Swahili traders developed, blending architectural styles, food traditions, and languages. Securing Goa, the jewel of the Estado da India. In 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur. Situated on India's west coast, Goa offered a deep harbour and a strategic location for controlling trade. It became the headquarters of the Portuguese Empire in Asia. Under Portuguese rule, Goa was transformed. Churches, monasteries, and palaces were built. Markets bustled with goods from across the Indian Ocean. Yet Portuguese dominance came at a cost. Local rulers who resisted were met with military force, and religious conversion was often pursued aggressively. Over time, a distinct Luso-Indian culture emerged, combining European and Indian elements in architecture, cuisine, and social life. Malacca, the gateway to the Spice Islands. In 1511, Albuquerque turned his attention to Malacca, a powerful sultanate controlling the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. Whoever held Malacca controlled access to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, where cloves and nutmeg grew in abundance. The Portuguese assault was swift and devastating. Malacca fell, and with it, the Portuguese gained a critical choke point for Asian trade. From here, they could project power into the South China Sea and the Indonesian archipelago. Reaching the Moluccas. The Portuguese had long sought direct access to the source of the spice trade. In 1512, an expedition from Malacca reached the Banda Islands, center of nutmeg production, and the Ternate and Tidor Islands, famous for cloves. Establishing permanent control was difficult. The island's rulers were skilled diplomats who played European powers against one another. But the Portuguese secured valuable trading agreements. By connecting the Moluccas to Goa and from Goa to Lisbon, Portugal completed one of the earliest truly global supply chains. Nutmeg and cloves, once worth their weight in gold in Europe, could now be shipped directly from their source. Portuguese influence in Japan. The arrival of Portuguese ships in Japan around 1543 marked the start of a new cultural and commercial exchange. The Japanese were fascinated by European firearms, which rapidly transformed their military strategies. Portuguese traders also introduced new foods like tempura, adapted from Portuguese frying techniques, and new words that entered the Japanese language. Jesuit missionaries, most famously Francis Xavier, arrived soon after, converting tens of thousands to Christianity before political shifts led to a crackdown on foreign religions. Still, the initial period of Portuguese-Japanese contact was one of vibrant mutual curiosity. Limits of Portuguese power. Despite its vast reach, the Portuguese Empire was never truly a territorial empire in Asia. It functioned more as a network of fortified trading posts, feitorias, linked by naval supremacy. This model allowed a small nation to dominate global trade routes, but it also left them vulnerable to rivals. By the mid-16th century, new challenges were emerging. Spain's conquest of the Philippines, the rise of Dutch maritime power, and the entry of English privateers into the Indian Ocean would soon threaten Portugal's monopoly. Portugal's golden era of exploration had created wealth and prestige, but it had also stretched the nation's resources to their limit. The empire's far-flung outposts were expensive to defend, and corruption among colonial administrators was common. These cracks would widen in the centuries to come. By the early 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence had been defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain dominated the Americas, while Portugal held the route around Africa to Asia. But a lingering question remained. Where exactly did the line of division wrap around the globe? That uncertainty and the lure of the Spice Islands set the stage for one of the most extraordinary voyages in history. The man, Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese by birth, born around 1480, but his most famous voyage would be under the Spanish flag. Magellan had served in the Portuguese fleet in India and East Africa, gaining first-hand experience in long-distance navigation. Yet after a falling out with the Portuguese crown, he offered his services to Spain. His proposal was bold. Rather than sailing east around Africa to reach the Moluccas, he would sail west across the Atlantic, navigate around South America, cross the unknown ocean beyond, and arrive in the Spice Islands, all within Spain's hemisphere, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. King Charles V of Spain, later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, saw an opportunity to challenge Portugal's monopoly and agreed to back the expedition. The fleet. The Armada de Molucca. In 1519, Magellan set out from Seville with 5 ships. Trinidad, his flagship. San Antonio Concepcion Victoria Santiago. The crew numbered about 270 men, a mix of Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Frenchmen, and others. Their supplies included wine, salted meat, hardtack, and trade goods for bartering in foreign ports. From the start, tensions simmered. Many Spanish officers resented serving under a Portuguese captain general, and rivalries would erupt into mutiny before the voyage was over. Crossing the Atlantic and the mutiny at Port St. Julian. The fleet crossed the Atlantic without major incident, making landfall on the coast of modern Brazil. Sailing south, they searched for a passage through the continent to the ocean beyond. In March 1520, with winter approaching, they anchored at Port St. Julian in present-day Argentina. There, 3 of the 5 captains mutinied against Magellan. The rebellion was swiftly crushed. 1 captain was executed, another marooned, and the rest returned to uneasy obedience. The Santiago was lost in a storm during a reconnaissance mission, reducing the fleet to 4 ships. Finding the strait. In October 1520, Magellan's fleet entered a labyrinth of channels at the southern tip of South America, the strait that now bears his name. The journey through was slow and treacherous, with strong currents, unpredictable winds, and sheer cliffs rising on either side. During the passage, the San Antonio deserted, turning back to Spain. But the remaining 3 ships emerged into an ocean unlike any they had known. The Pacific crossing Magellan named it the Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, because of its calm conditions compared to the storms of the strait. Yet the crossing would be anything but easy. They sailed for more than 3 months without sighting land, and their supplies dwindled. Men fell ill from scurvy, gnawing on leather to stave off hunger. By the time they reached the islands of Guam in March 1521, many had died. From Guam, they sailed to the Philippines, where Magellan became involved in local politics, forging alliances, and attempting to convert leaders to Christianity. Magellan's death in the Philippines. In April 1521, Magellan agreed to support one of his allies in a conflict against the neighboring island of Mactan. In the ensuing Battle of Mactan, Magellan was killed, struck down by warriors led by the chieftain Lapu-Lapu. His death left the expedition in chaos, but the surviving officers pressed on. The Spice Islands and the journey home. Under new leadership, the Trinidad and Victoria sailed to the Moluccas, loading their holds with precious cloves. The Trinidad attempted to return to Spain via the Pacific, but was forced back by storms and eventually captured by the Portuguese. The Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastian Elcano, took a different route. westward across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and north to Spain. When it arrived in September 1522, it carried only 18 of the original crew, the first humans to circumnavigate the globe. The significance of the voyage. Magellan's expedition proved beyond doubt that the Earth was a sphere and that the oceans were interconnected. It revealed the vastness of the Pacific and provided the first empirical sense of the planet's true scale. It also intensified the rivalry between Spain and Portugal. The Moluccas lay near the dividing line set by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and both crowns claimed them. The dispute was eventually resolved by the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, which adjusted the line in the Eastern Hemisphere. Spain's Pacific ambitions. The Philippines. Though the Moluccas ultimately fell into Portuguese hands, Spain maintained an interest in the Pacific. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi established a permanent Spanish settlement in the Philippines, naming the archipelago after King Philip II. The Philippines became the linchpin of the Manila galleon trade, an annual route that connected Asia and the Americas. From Manila, Spanish ships carried Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices across the Pacific to Acapulco in New Spain, Mexico. There, goods were transported overland to Veracruz and then shipped to Spain. This route, which lasted until 1815, created one of the first sustained global trading systems, linking Europe, the Americas, and Asia in a continuous exchange of goods, silver, and culture. A world connected. By the mid-16th century, the voyages of Columbus, de Gama, and Magellan had knitted together the world's oceans. No longer were the Americas, Africa, Europe, and Asia isolated spheres of human activity. Goods, ideas, technologies, and diseases now moved along global pathways. But this interconnected world came at a heavy cost. The destruction of indigenous societies, the rise of transoceanic slavery, and the intensification of warfare for control of lucrative trade routes. The age of exploration was as much an age of exploitation as it was of discovery. By the mid-16th century, the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, stood astride much of the known world's trade routes. The Treaty of Tordesillas had neatly divided the globe into two spheres of influence. But treaties on parchment were one thing. Enforcing them across vast oceans was another. Over time, new maritime nations emerged. England, France, and the Dutch Republic, each with its own motives, resources, and approaches. They would not only contest Iberian supremacy, but also create their own empires, reshaping the global order. England enters the seas. When the age
age of exploration began in earnest, England was not yet a major naval power. In the late 15th century, its attention was largely consumed by internal politics. The Wars of the Roses had left the kingdom politically fragile. Yet it was under the Tudor dynasty, particularly Henry VII and Henry VIII, that England began to eye the possibilities of overseas trade. The Cabot voyages. In 1497, John Cabot, a Venetian sailor in English service, sailed west from Bristol in search of a northern route to Asia. Instead, he reached the coast of Newfoundland, likely becoming the first European since the Vikings to set foot in mainland North America. Though his voyage did not yield immediate riches, it laid the groundwork for England's later claims in the New World. Cabot's second expedition in 1498 vanished, likely lost at sea. For decades afterward, England's overseas
ambitions remained sporadic, overshadowed by Spain's conquests. Elizabethan England, privateers and pirates. It was during the reign of Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, that England began to seriously challenge Spanish power, though often indirectly. Instead of confronting Spain head-on in territorial wars, Elizabeth encouraged privateers, privately owned ships authorized to raid enemy vessels, to target Spanish treasure fleets. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins became famous or infamous, depending on perspective. They combined exploration with piracy, plundering Spanish ports in the Caribbean, seizing galleons loaded with silver, and bringing wealth back to England. Drake's 1577 to 1580 circumnavigation was not only a feat of seamanship, but also a calculated act of economic warfare against Spain. He captured rich prizes along the Pacific coast of South America and returned to England with a hold full of treasure. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Tensions between Spain and England climaxed in 1588 with the launch of the Spanish Armada, a vast fleet intended to invade England and depose Elizabeth. The Armada's failure, due to English naval tactics and unfavorable weather, was a turning point. Spain remained powerful, but the aura of its invincibility was gone. For England, the Armada's defeat was a national triumph and a signal that it could play a greater role in overseas ventures. Early English colonies. In the decades after the Armada, English efforts to establish colonies began in earnest. The first attempt, at Roanoke in the 1580s, famously failed, leaving behind the mystery of the lost colony. Success came in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. Though plagued by disease, conflict, and starvation, Jamestown survived and became the seed of England's first permanent North American colony. Tobacco cultivation, introduced by John Rolfe, soon made it profitable. France's approach to exploration. France entered the age of exploration with ambitions in both the New World and Asia. Like England, France initially lagged behind Spain and Portugal, but it had strong maritime traditions along its Atlantic coast. Jacques Cartier and New France. In the 1530s, Jacques Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence and sailed up the St. Lawrence River, claiming the region for France. He made contact with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and wintered near present-day Quebec. Though Cartier failed to find a passage to Asia, his voyages marked the beginning of France's North American presence. By the early 17th century, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City, 1608, which became the capital of New France. The French focused on the fur trade, building alliances with indigenous nations like the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin. This approach relied more on partnership than outright conquest, though it was still rooted in colonial exploitation. French expansion in the Caribbean. France also moved into the Caribbean, establishing colonies in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, Haiti. These colonies would become major sugar producers, worked by enslaved Africans in brutal plantation systems. The Dutch Republic's meteoric rise. Of all the new maritime powers, the Dutch Republic's rise was perhaps the most rapid and dramatic. In the late 16th century, the Dutch were engaged in a long struggle for independence from Spain, the 80 Years' War. In fighting their former overlord, they developed both a fierce merchant spirit and formidable naval strength. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, the VOC was not merely a trading company. It was a quasi-state. It could wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and mint currency. Backed by wealthy Amsterdam merchants, the VOC sent fleets to the East Indies, modern Indonesia, to seize control of the spice trade from the Portuguese. In 1619, the Dutch captured Batavia, Jakarta, on the island of Java, making it their Asian headquarters. From there, they dominated the trade in cloves, nutmeg, and mace, often using ruthless tactics to maintain their monopoly. The Dutch West India Company, WIC, the WIC, founded in 1621, focused on the Americas and West Africa. It seized parts of Brazil from the Portuguese, raided Spanish Caribbean ports, and established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, the seed of modern New York City. Challenges to Iberian dominance. By the early 17th century, the Iberian world was no longer unchallenged. English, French, and Dutch ships harassed Spanish galleons in the Caribbean, set up their own colonies in the Americas, and competed in the Asian spice trade. The Iberian powers struggled to defend their vast, scattered empires. Maintaining garrisons, fortresses, and fleets across multiple oceans strained their finances. Portugal, in particular, suffered after its 1580-1640 union with Spain made it a target of Spanish enemies. The spread of global trade networks. What had begun as separate spheres of exploration now blended into a single global network. Silver from Spanish mines in the Americas paid for Chinese silks and porcelain in Manila. Spices from the Moluccas were shipped to Europe by Portuguese, Dutch, and English traders. Enslaved Africans were carried across the Atlantic to labor in plantations, producing sugar, coffee, and tobacco for European markets. The wealth generated by these networks fueled the rise of European powers, but it also deepened global inequalities, entrenched systems of slavery, and sparked conflicts that would last centuries. By the early 1600s, the age of exploration had entered a new phase. The fevered search for new routes and unknown lands gave way to a determined struggle for control over the trade networks those discoveries had revealed. Oceans were no longer vast, empty spaces. They were highways of commerce, heavily trafficked by fleets of merchant ships and warships alike. What began as exploration was now empire building, and the seas themselves became battlefields where nations fought for dominance. One of the most important developments of this period was the rise of powerful trading companies. These were not mere merchant enterprises, but state-backed institutions with sweeping powers. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, founded 2 years later, were granted monopolies over trade in their respective regions. They could sign treaties, wage war, build forts, and govern colonies in the name of their home nations. This new model of commerce blurred the lines between private profit and national policy. Investors at home provided capital in exchange for shares, and the company's fortunes could swell or collapse entire economies. In Asia, the Dutch moved with ruthless efficiency to dominate the spice trade. They expelled the Portuguese from key ports and seized the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg at the time. In 1621, in an infamous act that shocked even their European rivals, Dutch forces massacred or enslaved most of the Banda population to secure their monopoly. From their new headquarters at Batavia, on the island of Java, the Dutch oversaw a vast trading network that stretched from Japan to South Africa. Ships loaded with cloves, nutmeg, pepper, silk, and porcelain passed constantly through the harbour, their cargoes bound for markets across Europe. The English, lacking the initial power to match the Dutch in Southeast Asia, began focusing more of their efforts on India. They established fortified trading posts at Surat, Madras, and Calcutta, slowly weaving themselves into the rich trade in Indian textiles, spices, and later tea. At first, their presence was tolerated by the Mughal Empire, which ruled much of India. But as the century progressed, the English presence grew in both influence and ambition. The French, determined to challenge both English and Dutch dominance, founded their own East India Company in 1664. From their bases at Pondicherry and Chandernagore, they too entered the textile trade, building alliances with local rulers while competing with their European rivals. The competition in Asia was fierce, and battles were not always fought with cannon fire. Trade agreements, strategic marriages, and manipulation of local politics were just as important as military strength. But when negotiations failed, violence was never far away. Naval skirmishes flared in the waters off India and Southeast Asia, and the control of even a single port could shift the balance of power in a region. While these contests raged in Asia, the Atlantic world was also undergoing a transformation. The Caribbean, once dominated almost entirely by Spain, became a patchwork of European possessions. English, French, and Dutch settlements took root on islands such as Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Curaçao. These colonies were devoted to producing sugar, which had become one of Europe's most lucrative commodities. The demand for sugar was insatiable, and its production relied heavily on enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade grew to monstrous proportions in this period, with ships carrying human cargo from the coasts of West Africa to the plantations of the New World, in a brutal triangular route that also carried sugar, rum, and manufactured goods. In North America, England's early colonies began to expand beyond their precarious beginnings. Jamestown survived its troubled early years, and new settlements were established along the eastern seaboard. In the north, the Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, seeking religious freedom but quickly building a thriving economy based on trade, fishing, and small-scale farming. France, focusing on the fur trade, extended its influence deep into the interior of the continent through a network of rivers and alliances with indigenous nations. Quebec became the hub of this vast enterprise, while smaller outposts dotted the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley. The Dutch, too, claimed a foothold in North America, founding New Amsterdam at the mouth of the Hudson River. Although their tenure there would be short-lived, the English seized it in 1664 and renamed it New York. The Dutch imprint remained in trade patterns and cultural life. By the mid-17th century, it was clear that the Iberian monopoly on global trade had ended. The world's oceans had become an arena of constant competition, with England, France, and the Dutch Republic all firmly established as maritime powers. Yet this was not an age of peaceful coexistence. Wars erupted repeatedly, both in Europe and in distant colonies, as each nation sought to expand its share of the world's wealth. Naval technology advanced rapidly, fleets grew larger, and strategies became more sophisticated. Victory at sea could bring a nation riches beyond imagination. Defeat could plunge it into ruin. Still, for all the rivalry and bloodshed, there was a growing sense that the world had become a single interconnected stage. A ship leaving Batavia might carry nutmeg from the Banda Islands to Amsterdam, then sail on to the Caribbean with manufactured goods, and finally return home with sugar harvested by enslaved laborers. In this new global order, fortunes rose and fell on the winds and currents that linked every continent. Exploration had given way to empire, and empire, as the coming centuries would prove, brought both extraordinary wealth and profound human tragedy. By the late 17th century, the age of exploration was no longer just a story of daring voyages and distant conquests. It had become a story about ideas, about how the discoveries of new lands, peoples, and natural wonders transformed the way Europeans understood their place in the world. The centuries of exploration had not only enriched empires, they had reshaped knowledge itself. When Columbus returned from the Caribbean, or Vasco da Gama from India, their cargoes contained more than gold and spices. They brought back plants and animals that had never been seen in Europe, strange artifacts from far-off cultures, and tales of landscapes that seemed almost mythical. Over time, these returns swelled into an overwhelming flood of information. Scholars, merchants, sailors, and rulers began to realize that the known world was far larger, more diverse, and more interconnected than their ancestors could have imagined. This wave of new knowledge fed directly into the intellectual ferment that would become the scientific revolution. The voyages of exploration required precise navigation, and the quest for accuracy drove advances in cartography, astronomy, and mathematics. Mariners began relying on increasingly detailed sea charts, improved astrolabes, and cross-staffs to plot their position. The development of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, which allowed sailors to calculate longitude with precision, would be the culmination of centuries of effort driven by the needs of global navigation. Maps changed dramatically during this era. Early world maps, filled with decorative sea, monsters, and imaginary islands, gave way to more accurate representations of coastlines and continents. By the mid-1600s, European mapmakers like Joan Blieu and Guillaume de Lisle were producing atlases that reflected an unprecedented level of geographical knowledge. Yet maps were never purely scientific. They were also tools of power, claiming territories on paper before they were conquered in reality. Natural history became another field transformed by exploration. Ships returned to Europe with botanical specimens, live animals, and preserved curiosities from all over the globe. These were studied, catalogued, and displayed in the cabinets of curiosity that became popular among the wealthy. What began as personal collections of oddities evolved into the great natural history museums of later centuries. The study of exotic plants also had a practical purpose, identifying crops that could be grown in colonies for profit. Sugarcane, tobacco, coffee, cacao, and spices all spread along the routes forged by explorers, altering diets and economies around the world. Contact with other cultures also forced Europeans to confront their own assumptions about humanity. Encounters with the peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia challenged long-held ideas inherited from classical and medieval sources. Writers and philosophers began to ask new questions about human nature, society, and morality. Some, like Michel de Montaigne, used these encounters to critique European arrogance, pointing out that so-called savages often lived with a harmony and dignity lacking in European societies. Others, however, used cultural differences to justify domination and enslavement, creating pseudo-scientific theories that would feed into later systems of racial hierarchy. The vast expansion of trade networks also had profound economic effects. The influx of silver from the Americas, especially from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia, transformed global commerce. Spanish silver coins circulated as far away as China, where they became a standard currency. This early form of globalization meant that economic events in one part of the world could have ripple effects thousands of miles away, a concept that would become even more pronounced in modern times. At the same time, exploration changed the rhythm of everyday life in Europe. New foods like potatoes, maize, tomatoes, chocolate, and coffee entered diets and reshaped agriculture. Coffee houses became centers of conversation, politics, and business, places where merchants discussed shipping news, alongside scholars debating philosophy. The taste for sugar grew to such an extent that it shifted entire economies and fueled the brutal expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. Religious life, too, was transformed. Catholic missionaries, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans traveled alongside traders and soldiers, bringing Christianity to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. They translated religious texts, established schools, and sometimes acted as cultural intermediaries. In China, Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci learned the language, adopted local dress, and exchanged knowledge of Western astronomy and mathematics for entry into imperial circles. Yet religious encounters were rarely equal exchanges. They were often bound up with the politics of empire and the pressure to convert. By the close of the 17th century, the knowledge gained from exploration was not confined to court cartographers or merchant guilds. Books describing distant lands were printed in increasing numbers, often embellished with engravings of exotic scenes. Some were serious works of geography and ethnography. Others were sensationalized accounts of cannibals, treasures, and monsters. Whether factual or fanciful, they fired the public imagination and kept the appetite for exploration alive. The age of exploration, then, was not just about ships crossing oceans. It was about minds expanding to grasp a more complex, interconnected, and often unsettling world. This shift in perspective laid the intellectual groundwork for the Enlightenment, when reason, observation, and curiosity would become guiding principles. The explorers had redrawn the map of the world. The thinkers of the Enlightenment would try to redraw the map of the human mind. By the dawn of the 18th century, the web of colonies, trade routes, and naval strongholds built over the previous 200 years had matured into vast imperial systems. The seas were crowded with merchant fleets carrying goods between continents, protected by warships that patrolled strategic choke points. Europe's great powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent Portugal, were now locked in a constant struggle, not just for wealth, but for total control of the oceans. This was the age of the fully developed colonial empire. The scattered trading posts of earlier centuries had grown into fortified ports, sprawling plantations, and bustling colonial cities. In the Caribbean, islands like Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Domingue, and Martinique were transformed into sugar-producing machines, their wealth extracted through the brutal labor of enslaved Africans. In India, European trading companies expanded their influence far beyond coastal enclaves, forging alliances with and waging wars against local rulers to secure control of entire regions. In North America, colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard, their populations swelling through immigration and the forced transport of enslaved people. The stakes were higher than ever, and the competition between empires spilled into full-scale wars that played out across multiple continents. What began as European conflicts now had battlefields in the Caribbean, North America, Africa, and Asia. Naval supremacy became as important as victories on land. A single decisive engagement at sea could cut off a colony from reinforcements, starve it of supplies, and hand it to a rival. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, was one of the first truly global conflicts of the 18th century. Ostensibly fought over who should inherit the Spanish throne, it quickly became a contest over Spain's overseas empire. Battles raged in the Americas, where British forces captured Gibraltar and established themselves as a major naval power in the Mediterranean. In North America, this war was known as Queen Anne's War, marked by raids on frontier settlements and clashes between colonial militias, indigenous allies, and European troops. The mid-18th century saw the rivalry between Britain and France dominate world politics. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, called the French and Indian War in North America, was the most far-reaching conflict the world had yet seen. It was fought in Europe, the Americas, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. In North America, British forces, with their indigenous allies, eventually overwhelmed French Canada, capturing Quebec and Montreal. In India, the British East India Company clashed with French forces and their allies in the Carnatic Wars, leading to British dominance in Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 redrew the global map. France ceded Canada and its claims east of the Mississippi to Britain, while handing Louisiana to Spain. Britain gained Florida from Spain in exchange for returning Havana. In India, French influence was reduced to a handful of trading posts, paving the way for British expansion across the subcontinent. This was the moment when Britain emerged as the world's leading naval and colonial power. Its empire, spanning the Atlantic, and reaching deep into Asia. The Netherlands, though still a significant trading power, found itself increasingly overshadowed by Britain and France. Its East Indies empire remained profitable, but its influence in the Americas declined after losing key colonies. Portugal, too, retained Brazil and its African possessions, but was no longer the dominant force it had been in the 16th century. Yet even as empires expanded, they became more difficult to control. The long supply lines that connected colonies to their European capitals were vulnerable to storms, pirates, and enemy warships. Colonial governors often acted with considerable independence, pursuing their own interests as much as those of the crown. In the colonies themselves, tensions grew between settlers and their imperial rulers. Merchants resented restrictions on trade, while colonists chafed under taxes and regulations imposed from across the ocean. The economic engine of empire in the 18th century was powered not only by manufactured goods and natural resources, but by human lives. The Atlantic, slave trade reached its peak, with millions of Africans transported under horrific conditions to work in plantations and mines. The profits from slavery enriched European merchants, funded industrial development, and paid for the ships and armies that sustained imperial expansion. But this human cost, so long ignored or justified, would eventually fuel growing movements for abolition. By the close of the century, cracks were beginning to appear in the seemingly unshakable imperial order. The American Revolution in 1776 showed that colonies could break free, inspiring unrest elsewhere. In Haiti, enslaved people rose in rebellion in 1791, ultimately defeating French forces and establishing the first independent Black Republic in 1804. The Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century would further upset the balance of power, but in the 18th century's heyday, empire seemed unstoppable, its sails catching the wind of global ambition. The age of exploration had given birth to this world of competing empires, and the 18th century represented its fullest expression. A planet crisscrossed by trade routes, dominated by naval power, and bound together in a network of commerce, culture, and conflict. Yet the very forces that had built these empires, ambition, greed, and the restless pursuit of advantage, would also be the seeds of their undoing. By the opening decades of the 19th century, the world's coastlines were, for the most part, mapped. The great sea routes were established, and the age of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan had given way to a different kind of exploration. This was an age no longer driven solely by the desire to find trade routes or seize territory, though those motives never entirely disappeared. Instead, the focus began to turn toward charting the unknown interior spaces of continents, deepening scientific knowledge, and extending imperial influence through diplomacy, treaties, and the quiet, but no less decisive, spread of industry. The Napoleonic Wars had shaken Europe to its core, toppling old dynasties, redrawing borders, and straining colonial systems. Spain and Portugal, once supreme in overseas empire, found themselves weakened. Spain's American possessions rose in revolt, and by the 1820s, nearly all of its colonies in Latin America had achieved independence. Portugal, too, lost control over Brazil in 1822, marking the end of its largest and most profitable colony. The Iberian dominance that had once defined the age of exploration was over, replaced by a new order in which Britain, France, and, increasingly, new powers like the United States and Russia took the lead. Britain entered the 19th century as the preeminent naval and colonial power, with holdings that stretched from the Caribbean to India and from Africa to Australia. Its navy was unmatched, ensuring that British merchant fleets could travel with relative safety. Yet British exploration in this era was often driven as much by science as by commerce. Expeditions were dispatched to the Arctic to seek the Northwest Passage, to the Pacific to chart islands and study their peoples, and to Africa to trace the courses of rivers like the Niger and the Nile. These missions were often sponsored by learned societies, such as the Royal Geographical Society, whose members saw exploration as a way to expand human knowledge, though their findings frequently became the foundation for later imperial expansion. France, recovering from the upheaval of the Revolution and Napoleon's fall, also turned its attention to exploration and science. French expeditions sailed to the Pacific, to Southeast Asia, and deep into Africa, often accompanied by naturalists, artists, and surveyors who meticulously recorded landscapes, plants, animals, and local customs. The great voyage of the astrolabe under Jules Dumont d'Urville in the 1820s and 1830s is an example, a blend of science, diplomacy, and imperial reconnaissance. The 19th century was also the age of exploration into the heart of Africa. For Europeans, much of the continent beyond its coasts remained a mystery, its interior known only through fragmented reports from traders and missionaries. Figures like Mungo Park, David Livingstone, and Henry Morton Stanley became famous for their journeys along the Niger, Zambezi, and Congo rivers. Livingstone in particular embodied the blend of missionary zeal and geographical curiosity that defined much of Victorian-era exploration. While their expeditions brought back valuable maps and data, they also paved the way for the European scramble for Africa later in the century, when scientific curiosity gave way to outright conquest and partition. In the Americas, the young United States embarked on explorations of its own newly acquired territories. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 mapped the Louisiana Purchase, documented flora and fauna, and established contacts with indigenous nations. Though cast as a purely scientific endeavor, it was also a declaration of American intent to expand westward, often at the expense of those indigenous peoples. In the Pacific, exploration took on a new dimension as whaling ships, traders, and naval vessels ventured into island chains, previously visited only sporadically. Britain established colonies in Australia and New Zealand, displacing indigenous populations and transforming the landscape through agriculture and settlement. French interests in Polynesia grew, leading to the annexation of Tahiti and later New Caledonia. The islands of the Pacific, once distant waypoints for European navigators, became prizes in a new imperial game. At the same time, technological advances transformed exploration. The Industrial Revolution brought steamships that could travel regardless of wind, making journeys faster and more predictable. Railways, where they could be built, allowed explorers to push further inland. The development of more accurate surveying instruments, photographic equipment, and improved cartography meant that expeditions could record their findings with unprecedented precision. Scientific disciplines like geology, anthropology, and biology became formalized, and explorers often traveled with teams of specialists to study every aspect of the lands they visited. Yet, for all its scientific veneer, 19th century exploration was rarely free from the shadow of empire. The information gathered by explorers was of immense value to governments and commercial interests. A map showing a navigable river or a fertile plain could become the blueprint for colonization, even when the stated goal was the advancement of knowledge. The underlying current was often one of competition for resources, for prestige, and for control. By the mid-century, the romance of discovery that had colored the early age of exploration was giving way to a more systematic, industrial approach. Exploration had become a tool of statecraft, intertwined with diplomacy, trade, and military power. The white spaces on the maps were fewer than ever, but in the minds of Europe's powers, there was still much to claim, much to control, and much to exploit. The world was no longer unknown, but it was far from evenly shared. By the final decades of the 19th century, the white spaces on the maps were nearly gone. Coastlines had long been charted. River systems, mountain ranges, and inland plains were mapped with growing precision. The age of exploration, in its original sense, the quest to discover unknown lands and sea routes, was drawing to a close. Yet in another sense, it was transforming rather than ending. The era of discovery gave way to the era of domination, and the empires that had risen through centuries of exploration now turned their energy to consolidating and exploiting their holdings. The most striking expression of this shift was the scramble for Africa, a period between the 1880s and the outbreak of World War I, when European powers carved nearly the entire African continent into colonies. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized this process, with diplomats drawing borders on maps, with little regard for the peoples or histories of the regions being divided. What had once been the work of explorers, tracing rivers, crossing deserts, climbing mountain ranges, became the work of colonial administrators, soldiers, and companies, extracting resources for distant markets. In Asia, imperial rivalries played out in the Great Game, the strategic contest between Britain and Russia for influence in Central Asia. Expeditions here were as much about espionage and surveying for military purposes as they were about science. Britain sought to protect its Indian Empire, while Russia pushed southward through the steppes and mountains, their paths sometimes crossing in the high passes of Afghanistan and Tibet. In the Americas, the great age of territorial expansion was largely over, but exploration still continued in specialized forms. Scientific expeditions studied the Amazon, the Arctic, and remote mountain ranges, often working in partnership with newly independent Latin American nations, eager to chart and define their territories. The United States, having reached the Pacific, looked outward to Hawaii, the Philippines, and beyond, marking its arrival as a global power. The polar regions became the last great frontiers on Earth. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers like Fridtjof Nansen, Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, and Ernest Shackleton embarked on expeditions into the Arctic and Antarctic. These were ventures into places where no permanent human settlement could survive, where ice and extreme cold tested endurance to the limits. In 1911, Amundsen reached the South Pole, narrowly beating Scott's ill-fated party, which perished on the return journey. These expeditions, though often tragic, captured the public imagination, reviving the spirit of adventure that had driven the first great navigators centuries earlier. Technological progress altered the meaning of exploration itself. The invention of the airplane allowed aerial surveys, shrinking the time needed to map vast territories. Submarines began probing the depths of the oceans. The advent of photography and later film meant that explorers could bring back not only descriptions but images, making the distant and exotic more tangible to people at home. By the mid-20th century, satellites would revolutionize mapping, rendering many traditional surveying expeditions obsolete. The true symbolic end of the age of exploration on Earth came when there were no longer any uncharted regions to claim. Yet humanity's curiosity and the geopolitical rivalries that had always fueled exploration simply shifted to new arenas. In the second half of the 20th century, the frontier moved upward, beyond the atmosphere. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union echoed the great rivalries of the past. Just as Columbus's voyages had transformed Europe's understanding of the world, the first images of Earth from space transformed humanity's understanding of itself. The moon landing in 1969 was hailed as a triumph, not just of technology, but of the same adventurous spirit that had once sent caravels across uncharted seas. Today, exploration continues in the deep ocean trenches, in the dense rainforests that still hold undiscovered species, and in the vastness of space. Robotic probes travel to distant planets, telescopes peer into the origins of the universe, and research stations in Antarctica study a world at the edge of human endurance. Yet the legacy of the age of exploration remains deeply embedded in the modern world. The global trade networks established in the 15th through 19th centuries shaped economies that still operate on intercontinental scales. The cultural exchanges and cultural destructions set in motion by those first voyages have left their mark in languages, foods, religions, and social structures. The colonial boundaries drawn in the imperial era continue to influence international relations, often in ways that foster tension and conflict. The age of exploration was never a simple tale of courage and discovery. It was a complex, often contradictory period in which curiosity and greed, ingenuity and brutality went hand in hand. It connected the continents, created new possibilities, and expanded human knowledge. But it also brought conquest, exploitation, and suffering on an unprecedented scale. Its legacy is written not only in history books and maps, but in the very fabric of our globalized world. From the first tentative voyages along unknown coasts to the landing of a human footprint on another world, exploration has been one of humanity's most defining impulses. As we look forward to the next frontiers, perhaps on Mars or in the icy oceans of distant moons, we carry with us both the triumphs and the cautions of the past. The age of exploration may have ended, but the desire to venture into the unknown endures, as timeless and restless as the tides.